Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
It's been an eventful week, I guess. I moved all the way to Massachusetts, where I work for the American Institute for Economic Research. This will be the new Eastern headquarters for Harrigan Inc. for some while.
You got there right before the hurricane, didn't you?
Yeah, it turns out we didn't really get much except a stiff rain here, so no big deal. But here I sit, and it's actually been pretty nice working here. I think it's strange that they've hired a political scientist to work at the American Institute for Economic Research.
But, I think anymore that's necessary. Faculty outside of economics from time to time will say things to me like, well, economists should stop talking about things involving politics. My response is, we'll be happy to as soon as the politicians stop messing with the economy. I think so long as politicians mess with the economy, you've got to be able to talk about both economics and politics together.
That's right. I've got nothing to say on the matter except I'm going to talk about whatever I want. And everybody can just listen or not listen as they see fit. But of course, I'm just delaying the inevitable here. So what's new and exciting this week in your world, Anthony?
I've got a topic here that's even going to bore me. I was going to talk about...
I didn't know that was possible.
I was going to talk about inflation.
Here we go. Just get it over with.
I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. 2 weeks ago, the July inflation numbers came in. Going by the Consumer Price Index, consumer inflation from March through July was 4 times the average since 2000. So 4 times what we've experienced over the past 2 decades. So here's kind of the interesting thing. There are several ways to measure consumer price inflation. The CPI, which measures the average inflation among consumer prices, is 4 times its usual level. But then there are other measures, like, for example, CPI inflation less food and energy. This is, again, the CPI inflation, but they leave out, as you can imagine, food and energy prices, which tend to be more volatile. But that figure's also 4 times its usual level. Then there's consumption expenditure inflation that attempts to adjust for the fact that people alter what they purchase as prices rise. That measures also about 4 times its usual level. Then we've got producer price inflation, which is kind of an interesting thing to economists, but non-economists tend not to know that this thing exists. Producer price inflation looks at prices of things businesses typically purchase. And that number is more than 7 times its usual level. But then there's some good news here. And the good news is we have a measure that we tend not to use often. In fact, I wasn't aware this thing existed till I started poking around. The median consumer price index. And this measures, again, price inflation, but not based on average prices, but rather based on median prices. And that thing is only up 1.2 times its usual level. And what's interesting here is that suggests that these high numbers we're seeing, because they're all showing up in the averages, but they're not showing up in the median, they must be driven by just a couple of outliers. Interestingly, some analysts are saying exactly that. It appears that what's going on is that while many prices are indeed up by some amount, it's used car and truck prices alone, just those 2 things, used cars, used trucks, that are accounting for more than 1/3 of the increase that we're seeing in average consumer prices.
Good Lord.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. So I guess I don't have much of a conclusion here, but I'll repeat what I've said over the past couple of months. It's not clear yet whether we're in for particularly high inflation for the long haul or for the short haul, but I suspect that our decades of 2% to 2.5% inflation are pretty much history.
I would prefer if something were different here. But what can you really do?
This is what happens when you have a government that spends money it doesn't have.
I'm going to get us off this and talk about McDonald's instead. McDonald's is actually considering closing the indoor seating because of the new COVID strain. And if McDonald's is thinking about doing this, you can bet that every other restaurant and restaurant chain is thinking about the exact same thing. So we're about to move, I think, into a reconstituted lockdown, one that doesn't happen because local, state, federal government says so, but because businesses decide that they're better off this way. I think we're all going to end up inside our houses again before too long. I'm not looking forward to that. I mean, I don't begrudge McDonald's the right to do this. It's a publicly traded company. They can do whatever they want, as far as I'm concerned, and probably as far as anyone is concerned. Relatedly, Ant, I have the foolishness of the week. There are school board members across the country, and I'm getting this from an AP article that came out today, I believe it was. There are school board members across the country who are quitting their positions on various school boards because of how obnoxious and threatening people have become. You know, you and I deal with schools and, by extension, school districts quite a bit. And these are, generally speaking, thankless jobs. Right? These are the kinds of jobs that people inevitably do. Most of them don't even get paid, right? They're just on the school board. And now we've got people saying, okay, I've had enough. And the paragraph that gripped me was a center paragraph in the piece about what happened in Vail, Arizona, which is very close to where I live in Arizona. In Vail, speakers at a recent meeting took turns blasting school board members over masks, vaccines, and discussions of race in schools, even though the board had no plans to act on or even discuss any of those topics. It's my constitutional right to be as mean as I want to you guys, one woman said.
Wow.
And when we've gotten there, when it literally doesn't matter what somebody's about to say, you can launch on them no matter what, I wouldn't take that job either.
Yeah.
No reasonable person would. And we're going to end up here with a thing very similar to where we are in the political universe, right? That good people who would do a good job don't want those jobs. And people would do well to remember that because, once again, I'll say it, we get the politics we deserve. And if you keep yelling at people, well, we're going to get crappy outcomes.
Yep. To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. This week, Nathan Benefield joins us. Nate is Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Commonwealth Foundation, a public policy think tank in Pennsylvania. He has researched and written extensively on public policy issues, including the state budget, public sector labor reform, government spending and taxes, liquor privatization, education, and economic development. Nate, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So a couple of weeks ago, James and I put together an episode on term limits where we talked about armchair theory and argued that they were a bad idea. And Nate, a longstanding friend of ours, sends an email and says, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about. So, Nate, we welcome you to come and set the record straight. What can you tell us about term limits and why they're a good idea?
Yeah, and I'd say that, first it's, the practical experience with term limits and with legislators who have a lot of experience. I think, Anthony, you made the comment that you have legislators for a long time, that prevents the bureaucracy. I'd say from practical experience that lawmakers who have been in a long time tend to empower the bureaucracy, having built up relationships over a number of years. I think you see that in states like Pennsylvania, which is where I work, and I don't know, to your home state, Anthony. We have a full-time legislature. No term limits. A lot of people have been in office a long time, and a growing bureaucracy. States, that have term limits actually have less regulation, less taxes than those without. I don't think anybody says, hey, thank goodness we have Nancy Pelosi with 35 years of experience and Chuck Schumer with 40 years of experience. Look how they've reined in that bureaucracy and kept the federal government in check.
You've done research into comparing outcomes in various states, those that have term limits, those that don't?
Yeah, we did this. We did some analysis comparing states that have term limits, states that don't. About 15 states have term limits on legislators. Others have done similar studies. I know Matt Mitchell, scholar at Mercatus, has done similar. He's found no relationship. Our findings was a slight negative relationship with states that have term limits and having less regulation, lower taxes, and spending. It is somewhat of a check on government, though not the most important thing.
And because of that, Nathan, it seems that you've got a real uphill climb if you want a constitutional amendment to come along and address this.
Absolutely. Like you do it at the federal level, you need a constitutional amendment. What you don't want to have is have one state having term limits on their members of Congress and another state that doesn't. It is certainly true that lawmakers who have been around longer have more power, have more seniority, able to get things done more easily. There is some benefit to longer tenure, but I think once you get past 6, 8, 10 years, quote unquote, institutional knowledge is already there.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you'd be probably very much in favor of a number of different answers across the states.
Correct. One of the more impactful is not so much term limits, so much as the part-time versus full-time legislature, and seeing that defined in how long they're in session, what their pay is, which really goes from a range of $0 In Mexico, I think New Hampshire's $200, up to $110,000 in California for legislator.
That might be all housing allowance in California, right? Who knows? I remember back, it was a bunch of years ago, Ant and I compared the Pennsylvania legislature to the Texas legislature and came up with a bunch of very interesting comments, right? So maybe you can flesh that out a little bit, because I suspect most of our listeners really don't know how different these places are.
Right. Pennsylvania is one of the states that has the highest level of professionalization. Pennsylvania is a little less than California and New York with $90,000 salary, has among the most staff, more than 2,000 legislative staff. A lot of states have very few. And then the time in session. So Pennsylvania, they come in after an election, have 2 years of a legislative session, continue to pass things. Other states like Texas have a limited time frame once every 2 years, and they have a few months and then 15 months off.
That's very assuring. I see that and I think I would like to live with that kind of legislature, the kind that doesn't do all that much.
Yeah, it doesn't do much, and it really is where it's a part-time job.
No.
So lawmakers, they come in for a few weeks or months, pass laws, and then go live under those same laws that they passed, versus the full-time professional legislature. Their job is being a legislator, often doing it for 20 or 30 years, become very insulated from the private sector, how the real world works.
That comparison is really fascinating because in every way, Texas is way larger than Pennsylvania. Population, size, economy, everything. And yet they have a legislature that meets every other year and not even for the whole year. Now, you've said a couple of things. You said that with a part-time legislature, the legislators pass the laws and then have to go back and live with them. Presumably they have some other job, this sort of thing. And you mentioned a couple of states where the pay is particularly low. I used to live in West Virginia, and when I was there, and I don't recall whether their legislature is full or part-time, but when I was there was a big discussion about raising the legislative wages. And of course, everybody's saying, no, you shouldn't raise it. These guys don't do anything. And it occurred to me that if the wages are particularly low, and I think this also applies if it's a part-time job, pretty much the only people who can hold those positions are basically the independently wealthy or the self-employed. The regular guy on the street can't afford to be a legislator. Is that a correct take on this?
I think if you look at the people who do serve in other states, I don't think it's at all the independently wealthy. There are people who have jobs that are not year-round, or there are certain jobs you can do part-time and go back to those jobs. People who are retired, a spouse works. I would say it's largely not independently wealthy individuals. You do see truly some of those states that is a citizen legislature, representative of the people.
We may have backed right into another interesting question here, because as I'm thinking about the comparison between Pennsylvania and Texas, all of a sudden I want to find out if there's a bureaucratic difference, meaning to say if a part-time legislature over-bureaucratizes, knowing that it's going to have to do a bunch of things, whereas maybe a full-time legislature would be loath to do it. Of course, what I know of Pennsylvania and Texas militates against the answer I just gave, but I'd still want to take a look at it. Do you have any sense of it?
I think it is, and especially if you look at the states that are at the top of the list in terms of full-time legislature, New York, Pennsylvania, California, Michigan. Those are the states that also have some of the biggest bureaucracies. In our analysis, it was pretty clear that there was a clear correlation between full-time and part-time legislatures and taxes, spending, regulation across the board. The question is kind of chicken or the egg, or is it states that built up the full-time legislature because they have a political environment that wants more government, wants more regulation?
The argument we made a couple of episodes ago was that with term limits, you lose institutional memory. So you've got a legislator who comes in, he's there for a few years, whatever it is, and then he's term limited out. And so the institutional memory then lies with the bureaucracy. Our argument was that that empowers the bureaucracy. What you're telling us is the evidence you're finding is that it's actually the reverse.
Yeah, and I think there's a few reasons why I'd say it's the reverse of why the longer tenured empowers the bureaucracy. One is the iron triangle of the relationship between legislators and the bureaucracy and special interest lobbyists. The longer they're in power, the more trades they make, more favors they have. I've certainly seen that of those who have been in office a much longer time, have the connections, make deals. There also is the evidence that empowering the bureaucracy in order to avoid having to make tough votes. One of the recent examples of moratorium on evictions. Congress couldn't get that passed, but they were happy to see the administration put it in place. Now, obviously, that was struck down by the court as being unconstitutional. I think rightly so, is not something that the CDC simply has the power to do. Lawmakers liked that they could put out a notice on the one hand saying, hey, the eviction moratorium is extended, you can stay in your home. On the other hand saying, hey, I didn't vote for it, that was the Biden administration. Can't hold me accountable. And being able to avoid the accountability while also talking about what was done at the administrative level.
Do you see any sort of a trend? I haven't looked at the data, but over time, are states moving in one direction or the other, full-time, part-time, term limit, not term limit?
There hasn't been much recent action on this. I think there was a wave 20 to 30 years ago of putting in place term limits. The direction on full-time, part-time has only gone towards full-time. I think most states had citizen legislatures and expanded the pay and benefits and time in office. Pennsylvania was basically a citizen legislature until the late 60s, evolved from there into being a full-time legislature.
And how do you respond to the argument that basically all states and the federal government have term limits, in that when the election comes around, we could just vote the guys out?
I agree that, hey, we should vote when they're doing a bad job. I think a couple things that have certainly changed since the founding of our country is the powers that they have to use to help give the incumbents advantage. And that is both the name recognition, the franking privileges, but also the ability that if you were challenging a sitting member of Congress, you have to go to people for asking for money. Well, their name is going to be disclosed on campaign finance reports. And the current member of Congress is going to see that and have the ability to go threaten those people, punish them, harass their business. Yeah, you can vote the person out, but more often than not, there's not even a challenger to vote for. You can vote them out, but when they're unopposed, you're right, and it's probably not going to be a very successful candidate.
If you're running unopposed, people would have to conclude that your constituency is rock solid. I don't see a way to make an argument that people who run opposed are some sort of advertisement for the benefits of term limits, because ultimately, I think what you're saying is the voters want this person, but they shouldn't. And I want to avoid that kind of thing right down to the core.
Yeah, and I think that certainly voters want to reelect someone, they absolutely should be able to. I'm open to that principle and idea, but I'm also realizing that in practice, those who are not doing a great job are also able to avoid having opposition because it is so tough to challenge a sitting incumbent. And oftentimes in districts that there's only one party competition. For a Republican in a safe seat, only another Republican can challenge you, and Democrats, only another Democrat can really challenge you. And no one is willing to do that in the primary. That is often the case that the majority of seats go unchallenged. Now, are all those lawmakers bad? Not at all, but even bad lawmakers can avoid challenge. And in some cases, there's more lawmakers who leave office through death or conviction than in a primary loss.
But from what you're saying here, I think Nancy Pelosi is a perfect example, right? She's about as untouchable as you can imagine. Her constituents seem to like that. Why can't they get what they want? They vote for it, and then now they have to pass some second hurdle because we don't like who they like. I just don't see how this gets operationalized without a fair amount of this problem wrapped up in it.
This is kind of a question you had, a question of a democracy versus a republic, that getting 50% doesn't necessarily mean that something is right or true. Same thing, it's like, hey, can we elect someone, 50% of the people in the district voting for them? That's certainly the democratic principle. The Republican principle is we put limits on the powers of what Congress can do, majority can do, what the majority rule can do. And one of those limits can be in terms of who you can actually elect.
I think you and I are in heated agreement on this in the end. But here's the sad part. When you sit back and think about it, state after state after state, what you would have to do is prevail upon the people who you would term limit out to pass legislation guaranteeing that they would be out of a job before too long. That's really hard.
Yeah. I think the differences between the states is the different powers of initiative. States that have term limits have done it through initiative. Yeah. Voters just put it on the ballot. Some states like Pennsylvania, to amend the Constitution here, you'd need lawmakers who put it on the ballot. So there's, I would say, literally 0% chance we're going to amend the state constitution to have term limits because lawmakers are never going to put term limits on the ballot.
I can't see a way that that's not true. What we all know of human nature.
One of the things I say is you give lawmakers and politicians a bad name of like, oh, all they ever care about is re-election. That's just part of human nature. No one wants to lose their job. The added corollary of that is people say, hey, why don't they all get along? Why can't we be bipartisan? But most people don't like co-workers who try to get them fired every 2 years, which is really what other having them doing for the lawmakers.
I've never thought of it in those terms. So that's exactly right. That's hilarious. Ant, maybe you've got something to say about public choice here?
Well, no, I've actually got a slightly different question. The goal, as I hear you saying, is to overcome the incumbency effect. So the idea is with the term limits, you don't have the guy who because of the incumbency effect, can keep getting elected again and again. And I wonder, are we killing the proverbial fly with the sledgehammer? Are there less intrusive tools that can help overcome the incumbency effect without having term limits?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are things to limit the powers of government, limit the ability to spend on things like franking privileges. Donor privacy is something that is a priority. And you've seen a recent Supreme Court case that was protecting nonprofit donors from having scrutiny in California. The state had wanted a list of all of your donors for any organization that maybe criticizes politicians. I can see how that leads to retribution and not simply any good government principle. I think those are some of the things that can help reduce the power of incumbency or limit on the powers of the legislature that need to be in place for a more free society.
And franking privileges, am I correct? This is the ability for the lawmaker to send out mail free of charge?
Yeah, basically, at the governor's level, they send out mail free of charge with their name on it saying, courtesy of Congressman so-and-so. Here's the newsletter. Oftentimes, those newsletters are important information about deadlines and certain things, but also here is me marching in the parade and congratulating new Eagle Scouts and all those things that are nice PR.
The donor privacy angle is very interesting because every time I've encountered the discussion on donor privacy, it's always been phrased as we want to know who amongst the populace is supporting various candidates so we know in whose pocket the candidate is. But now you're describing it in the other direction. We want to protect the donor so that the opposing politician can't come down on him for donating to the opposition.
Yeah, I think that has been a consequence of all of the campaign finance disclosure things that, hey, there is now a list of everyone who's given to the candidate, a list who can be threatened and harassed. You've seen that of protests of people going to houses of donors to different campaigns and different candidates. That has certainly been a consequence. And it's been justified in terms of the contributions to candidates of, well, this helps prevent the corruption or the idea of corruption by having their list of donors. But a lot of groups, and there's been legislation pending in Congress, to like, let's try and expand that to nonprofits, groups who do independent expenditures, and call them dark money groups, or criticizing candidates or running independent ads. But that doesn't have the impact of corruption. You're not giving to a candidate, you're running ads or materials about them, about their voting record. But it really can be a way to threaten the donors of those groups who are criticizing their politicians and providing what I think is the most important type of political speech. And really, the ruling that came down recently on the California case reiterates what happened decades ago. I think everyone would agree with it was NAACP versus Alabama, where the state of Alabama wanted to know who was donating to the NAACP in a time when segregation, to anybody who was donating to the NAACP, it would really threaten their lives. That list of donors was out there.
Nathan, this would have been a perfect place to end, but I can't help myself. I got another question that pokes at one that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, and that's franking. I can't imagine that franking privilege still has the authority it did, say, in 1984, but it's still something. And I wonder if you could weigh in on how much effectiveness has been lost with franking as electronic communication has replaced the mail as the norm.
I think the franking itself, as defined properly as the freedom of the mail and having access to that, probably has declined. But at the same time, having legislative staff who are able to post on your social media and your Facebook page and create that.
Right.
There was a story in Pennsylvania, maybe it was 2 years ago, of the number of legislative staff whose part of their job had been writing their boss's Wikipedia page and editing that. Clearly, able to use taxpayer resources to promote the profile of officials and politicians.
All right, I want to make sure I understand this. Are you saying that the franking privileges are being used to pay staff to maintain the social media presence of the legislators?
Take into consider the franking privilege. The actual term franking privilege is, it simply is a matter of, hey, we have people on staff. Part of their job is maintaining the official public social media page. And that official page can't be used for campaigning, but it does get their name out there. It does put out announcements on what they're doing in the district, notices about what legislation they've introduced to help get their name out there and why there is such a great incumbent advantage.
This was great. I really appreciate you reaching out to us and saying that we got it wrong, because this is an interesting perspective that we're getting here.
I do too. And we're always happy to admit when we've been wrong. And to some degree, we were here. We're happy you called us on it. We're even happier that you came for a visit.
I think it is kind of a tie between public choice theory and seeing it in practice and how it works.
Before you go, what interesting things are you doing at the Commonwealth Foundation?
Our work right now is educational choice, and I've seen a lot of success across the country, some in Pennsylvania even on expanding educational choice. And there's continued opportunity with that. I think a lot of parents, even in the fall, looking for different options with those having mask mandates and fighting over that. And then on a lot of issues coming out of COVID and regulatory relief, a lot of regulations suspended during COVID. The disaster declaration being over in Pennsylvania, like, all right, some of these regulations will be coming back in. We're working with what should be kept in place permanently. They need to be suspended during COVID. Maybe they shouldn't be in place ever.
You mentioned educational options there, and I have to say, in the 10 or so years that my family lived in Pennsylvania, we were in a virtual charter homeschool,
Yeah.
and it was just fantastic. Was it perfect? No, you shouldn't be looking for perfection. Was it very, very good? It absolutely was. And I think to the extent you're on that issue, you're on the side of the angels here.
That's what I'm most passionate about.
I'm really happy to hear it. And if you ever need a blurb for the outside of something, I'd be happy to talk it up for you.
Great.
We'd be happy to have you back to talk about whatever it is you're working on.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about some other thing that will be even more scintillating than that thing we talked about today. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. You can join our Backstage group on Facebook where the conversation continues. And
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
And in the meantime, between this moment and the next moment, we're together. Be nice to each other. I know you want to yell at people. I do too, but let's not. See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.